Welcome to the One Life Maps podcast. Here's your host and co-author of Listen to My Life, Maps for Recognizing and Responding to God in My Story, Sharon Swing.
Greetings, everyone. This is Sharon Swing. I am so excited to have this conversation, and you're actually joining in on a conversation that Ashlee and I have already started today. I have with me Ashlee Eiland, the author of Humankind, How Reclaiming Human Worth and Embracing Radical Kindness Will Bring Us Back Together. Ashlee serves as a formation and preaching pastor at Mars Hill Bible Church. She shares God's message of redemption and reconciliation at conferences, colleges, and events around the country. Ashlee earned a BA in International Relations from the University of Southern California and completed her master's in organizational leadership at Judson University. Ashlee and her husband, Delwyn, live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, with their 3 children who are all social distancing.
Yes,
Welcome,
we are. Thank you, Sharon. It's such a joy to be here. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to do everything I can to encourage people to get this book in their hands and read it.
Thank you. That's kind.
I am just really pleased that we have some people that might listen to this from our audience to be able to do that with. And this book it's a memoir. It is a series of stories that have a thread through it that asks us to consider kindness as the antidote to a lot of the injustice and fear and hatred in the world. And before we get started really in the conversation, Danielle Strickland did such a great job in the intro of saying who you are. She is a holy, mysterious, beautiful creation who has a sacred glow in the deepest part of her, a divine yes right at the center. I thought, how do you even take that in? I see that. People who know you see that, Ashlee.
It's with such humility. It's I remember reading Danielle's introduction for the very first time, and I cried because it felt like someone put into words the desire of my heart and how I navigate my relationship with God. That my whole pathway, especially in the past 10 or 11 years, my desire has been to say yes to God, regardless of how crazy or nonsensical it seems. And so I just love Danielle, and I honor her for the ways in which she has really led the way in showing us what it means to call out Imago Dei in someone else. And I think she did a beautiful job.
She did. And in your book, you choose particular stories that shaped you. And I mean, with Listen to My Life, we help people map their life stories. And I've always respected and honored the courage it takes to dive into your story. And Listen to My Life is kind of an on-ramp to that. But then taking on a project like this and taking these vignettes of moments that shaped you, and actually taking the time to write them out and to look at them again from the age you are now.
Yes.
What was it like for you to approach this project emotionally?
For me, it was, so caveat here, I've been a journaler my entire life. Ever since I could pick up a pen and knew how to string words together, that's how I've been processing the world. And so for me, this was probably the most intensive journaling exercise of my life, because I came up with the concept of kindness first, but it was I really do believe it was God's Spirit that inspired telling the story of kindness through narrative. And so for me, it was this really tender emotional journey, because so many of the stories in the book I'd processed already, either in the context of community or through professional counseling. But to look at them again from a different vantage point now with a family and, serving the church in a different way. It was a yes and amen to who God is, really, of saying, Lord, you're the one who's been steadfast here. Like, clearly, when I was not, when the circumstances surrounding my story were anything but sure, I could see, in essence, especially doing this chronologically, how God's fingerprint was all over my life from the beginning. And that was felt like my soul was just, some parts pained again, like there are some painful parts of this, but also more than that, just more committed to who God is, in writing these stories out and to sit in them again. And it sparked in me a desire for our world and our local community to come back to what really gives life and to what matters again, in the way of kindness and really tapping into the power of the fruit of God's Spirit. Mm-hmm. So it was a beautiful personal journey going through those stories again, but also I think it ignited a fire in me for kind of what I want my life's work to be. And so in that way, it was affirming as well.
How do you describe what you want your life's work to be?
Oh, it's straight from Isaiah 58. That's like the easiest question you could ask, because on a silent retreat, the Lord gave me just almost like this charge from scripture. And in Isaiah 58, the prophet's talking about true fasting. And Isaiah says, if you commit yourself to the poor, this is God speaking to the people. If you commit yourself to the poor, and to righting wrongs all around you, to taking care of the most vulnerable, he goes, you will be called rebuilder of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. And I felt like that's just, no matter what I do, whether I'm working in a church or at home full time, no matter where I go, what I do, it feels like that's the charge on my life, and that's to be a rebuilder and a restorer anywhere I go. And so that's what I hope this book accomplishes in part.
Oh, that's beautiful. Now, for our listeners that can't hear you, describe your upbringing and what perspective you're bringing to these stories.
Yeah. So I grew up as a Black woman in Houston, Texas. Grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, but there was actually a fair amount of diversity in certain pockets of that neighborhood. Houston is kind of a melting pot in and of itself. It's an international hub. And so I had the great gift of going to a school that is both, it's still an all-girls private Catholic school. So I did that for 13 years, predominantly white. So out of the 66, I believe it was, girls that I graduated with, there were 4 of us who were Black, but I also had friends from India, from England, from Pakistan. And so I have this really cool tapestry of friendships from my schooling that is one of the greatest gifts of my life. Like, I don't know if my parents meant to give me that gift intentionally, but I'm so glad that they did. So growing up in this predominantly white neighborhood, going to a predominantly white school, going to an all-Black Baptist church on the weekends for a season of our life growing up, and then my parents choosing to put me in activities where I would be exposed to a predominantly Black culture. So running track with the Amateur Athletic Union, going to the south side of Houston to do that, and being a part of majority there. It was almost an all-Black team. And then other experiences sprinkled throughout my life where really there were these 2 dominant cultures, and I felt like I did not fit well into either one of them. Mm-hmm. And so I was consistently straddling this fence, if you will, of like, where do I fit in? How do I, in essence, prove myself that I'm good enough to be in either one of these spaces, while also trying to navigate the core of my true identity apart from those spaces.
Right, because the way people were were responding to just who you are, but not just who you are, but basically the color of your skin is either you were not black enough or you were too black.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so, there's a chapter in the book where I talk about nicknames that I was given. And one of those nicknames, in the context of school, was Oreo, where it's like, okay, you're black on the outside, but you're really operating from a predominantly white cultural foundation. And so you're white on the inside, and trying to make sense of that. Or going to my track club and friends saying, well, why do you talk white? Like, why are you black, but you talk white? So in that sense, not being black enough for them, however they were defining that. And so this was a consistent struggle, not just in kindergarten through my senior year in high school, but beyond into college and even in my early 20s. And sometimes even now, having to ask some of the preliminary questions when I walk into any room or any space or environment where I might be the only woman or the only person of color. I'm finding that there are some knee-jerk questions that still surface that I'm handling differently, but they're still there. And so what does it look like to, in the context of kindness, not just give it away and to display it, but to receive it in those spaces where it feels like I'm in this relationship with the Spirit of God that doesn't just require me speak kindness to a broken world, but it allows me to receive kindness from God himself. And that's been my personal journey with kindness, and kind of the arc of how these stories paint that picture throughout my life personally.
Yeah, it seems like as I read the stories, like, okay, God is intentionally putting you in these places for the benefit of the learning of someone else, but then leaving you to navigate some things that make that very complex for you.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I was left in so many situations that I talk about in the book, still struggling. And it wasn't until enough time had passed to where I could glean some of the perspective of where God was in that situation. It took years in some cases to understand. Like, this wasn't just for someone else's learning. This was God either protecting me or shaping or informing me, or I truly believe that if I hadn't had some of those experiences now, I wouldn't be as in love with the church as I am right now. And so it was all for my good in the end, because God is good. But at the time, I don't know if I could have gotten there as quickly.
It's a big it's the series of kind of tangled messes.
Yes.
That as a reader, I can't tell you how many times I cried. And how many times I just felt so uncomfortable. Because I saw myself in the story at times. And I didn't like what I saw. And this is the best kind of teaching through story like this, Ashlee. I mean, I have not read a book quite like yours that is so honest from your own perspective, and also so ripe with the opportunity. I mean, it's just an honor to read it. And for me, growing up, and I don't remember there being people of color or in my high school, for example.
Sure. Yeah.
And totally unaware of how that situation happens, where a place ends up being kind of whitewashed.
Yeah.
And even just how segregated things went when I went to college. And just so many pieces of, like, how did I get my perspective on race and class, and how did I process through all that, and what were the events in my life that started to radically shift.
Yeah.
And the good news is my mom was always kind. And I think
I
I
love
think
that.
back I think back to um, just the pieces in my story that kindness was just going to be the choice,
Yes.
and because that's what I was handed,
Yes. Yeah.
and thank goodness it was.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And this is where I think, because we've all read books where it's here are the 5 ways to be more blank, right? And there's an academic approach, there's a lot of good data and research. And I think I could have written the book that way. I think I could have.
I'm so glad you didn't,
But
though.
I'm glad I didn't. And here's why, because especially in the context and the conversation of race and reconciliation, even if that reconciliation isn't racial, I have a desire to see shame and and unhelpful guilt lifted from the fabric of how we move closer to the understanding and the living out of the unity that Jesus prayed over us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something powerful about story that accomplishes that. Because there's so many things I didn't have to say explicitly, but to hear you say, Sharon, like, I was able to see and go back and meditate on some of, my experience. That's exactly what I was hoping to do in inviting people to consider their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, shame off you, whoever reads the book.
No kidding.
Shame off you.
We're all handed stories along
Yes,
the
that's
way,
it.
and we're
That's it.
and this whole process of what we do with mapping life
Mm-hmm.
stories. We keep saying it over and over again. This is a process of deciding what to take with you and what to leave behind.
Yes, and I still have my maps. I've had
There
these
you go.
maps for years, and they're so helpful. I actually referred a group that I was leading through this 3-part study on biblical kindness. In week 2, where we talk about the inward journey of kindness, I actually said, go to onelifemaps.com and see if there's anything there that Sharon and Joan can help with, because this is such a good tool and essentially another way. You can read a book, but there's also the work of looking at your story again,
Mm-hmm.
and to say, perhaps there are things there that I knew were there, but now we've got a different perspective, or now I've got more patience with myself, or now I have more time or more desire, or more is on the line. And this is a really beautiful invitation story in and of itself, whether it's ours or listening to someone else's. It's a really beautiful invitation to go deeper into the story of who God is.
No kidding. And one of my deep desires is to put diverse people together. I want men and women in the same listening groups. I want people of different backgrounds in the same group. Because how else are we going to bridge these gaps if we keep hanging out with the same people that are just like us?
That's right. That's
And
right.
If and your book is kind of one of those illustrations of, we have to hear one another's stories to be able to put down our perceptions,
Yeah.
and the stories we've been handed, and in a way that allows us to change from the inside out. I just don't know that there's a way forward except for God's Spirit putting us in the path of people that are different than us.
Completely. I mean, as you were talking, I envisioned, you're an artist, so hopefully this image resonates with you, but I'm envisioning broken glass, and we can make a mosaic out of one tone of broken glass, right? One color, that's fine. But the most beautiful mosaics, the most intricate pieces of art are the ones that have integrated so many different shades, textures, sizes, like those are the ones that hang in museums. Those are the ones that, we can point to and say there was time taken here. That piece is rich because of the integration of different forms and shapes and colors. And I kind of see it that way. I was reading an article about a way forward beyond this current moment of social distancing and COVID-19. And it says we have the possibility of rebuilding a future that's more in alignment with God's vision for us. Mm. And the question that it was such a beautiful article, but the question I had was, but who gets invited to build? You know, we have to be willing and hearing one another's stories and our perspectives, and being open to those perspectives being shifted to consider, how do we now do life together differently? And perhaps storytelling and listening to our own lives and other people's will be a part of that.
Yeah. It's that combination of learning how to listen and having the right circumstance, because sometimes it's just such an uncomfortable first piece of the conversation to invite the story of someone that's different than us, because we're afraid of showing our own ignorance even.
Oh, completely. I can't imagine. Like it's and even, yeah, but I hope though that there are multiple parts of this equation where there's fear showing up to the table because one might be afraid of one's own ignorance. But then on the other side of the table, there has to be this grace and this patience and perseverance to say what matters more than one's ignorance is the relationship that might be built on the other side of this.
Completely.
Yeah.
That's so well said. So
well said. I hope both sides of those equations are working well so that we can move to more mutual flourishing in that way.
Yeah. In the book, or the responses you've gotten from people who have read the book, are there any particular stories that get brought up most often?
Oh, for sure. The one about Charlottesville, protests and police. That one is by far the one that I get asked about the most.
Why don't you say a little bit about that story? Tell
Sure.
that story.
Sure. So a few years ago, there was a lot of tension and unrest in Charlottesville that made national headlines, and the hub, the core of a lot of that unrest was racially motivated. And these are broad details, you know, if you want to go online and folks can read more about the details. But here's what it inspired in me. I think we were living in a neighborhood at the time where right after Charlottesville happened, we started seeing Confederate flags pop up in multiple homes around us. And honestly, I was scared. You know, we were maybe the only Black family in this neighborhood, at least the only one that we knew of. And I just did not know how to be a good neighbor in an environment where I felt like I stood out like a sore thumb, and I could not be for sure how people were perceiving our existence. Like, it was such a mind game that I was playing with myself, and the end result was fear. And I remember just having a point of quiet time with the Lord and just really coming to this understanding that if I allowed fear to exist and have an elongated, defining mark on my life in that season, that I was going to be paralyzed. I wouldn't be able to do the work that God had called me into. I wouldn't be able to love my own family or other people well. And so I kind of did the thing that came the least naturally to me, and that was to reach out and to invite the representation of that fear into proximity. And so I ended up calling our local law enforcement and just saying, hey, I think we're all aware of what's going on in Charlottesville right now. You know, I'm so curious to know how this impacts your profession and how you think about events like these, and just wanting to know if anyone's interested in coming over. And then I did the most elementary thing, Sharon. I baked cookies with my daughter, and we mixed together some country time lemonade, and we just waited. And we had friends just come and sit in our living room just so we wouldn't be alone. And then 2 police officers showed up. They actually showed up at the time where we said, you know, this was happening. And we had this conversation about just what it was like for them in the neighborhood. I mean, and the conversation felt like a little underwhelming, to be honest with you. It felt very regular and normal. And yet I think the lasting impact of making that touch point was huge for me, because I could not hate and I could not fear that which I saw in the flesh. And it was so healing for me. Just to know that I was able to have that conversation. It was a microcosm of a larger thread that was running in and through our country of saying, like, no, I'm not going to be best friends with these two officers. And yes, there are still those situations where not everyone's going to have the same positive motivation or the same loving kindness toward one another. And we're seeing that even recently. But what I can control is I can choose to not be afraid. And sometimes stepping out of fear and into love looks like drawing closer and not farther apart.
Or just baking cookies.
Like just, anything to get me unstuck. And it seemed so, I mean, there were multiple times where I was like, what am I doing? Like, what am I really hoping to accomplish here? But the main point was I could not let fear win. Yeah. I couldn't. And so for that situation, for that day, the best I could do was to extend an invitation to bake some cookies and to wait. And I don't think I'll ever forget that moment.
I don't think I will either. Because I heard about the story.
Yeah.
And I remember your post on Facebook.
Yes. Yeah.
At that point in time. And I cried.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just cried.
Yeah.
I was sorry that it made you feel so fearful.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was so proud of you for having courage.
Yeah, thank you.
And just doing something, just the simplicity of it, but yet the power of it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll honestly, speaking just from a very honest place, sometimes courage, that type of courage displayed over and over again, gets really tiring.
I can imagine.
And
it's not your responsibility.
Right.
But you take it.
Yes. And that's where I think there's so much potential for increased partnership and awareness, especially, when we talk about in the context of Grand Rapids and kind of the church and the space that we're leading now is so committed to racial reconciliation because it needs to be a shared burden, Yeah. For so long, it's been people of color advocating for themselves and speaking up for themselves. Yeah. And it's just a heavy burden to bear. So yes, courage in that day, and also the lasting invitation to do that together.
I think I want to say to our listeners here that I didn't just pick up Ashlee's book randomly. Actually, I requested a copy from your publisher because I wanted them to know that podcasters were really interested in it for starters.
Thank you.
And the other piece of it was that that one showed up, but this is actually Matt's copy.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. So as soon as it was available on Amazon, Matt ordered this.
I love it.
And and he had, so he brought it with him to when he came to shelter in place with us, with his wife. And so now Tom has read it, and he wants me to tell you how much he loved your book as well.
Oh, thank you, Tom, wherever you are.
My husband, yes.
Yeah.
And so it's making the rounds in our household at this point in time. And I want our listeners to know that Ashlee has been an influential piece in my son's story as well as his friends' stories. through the youth ministry that Ashlee was a part of leading. And so I owe Ashlee a debt of gratitude for a piece of just the amazing young men that this group of friends have been growing into together for a long time now. I guess it's actually not that terribly long. It was only when they were in high school, but they just felt,
It's felt
they
longer.
grew up fast.
They do.
8 years, whatever it was.
That's right.
But you help provide the context for them to grow those friendships and have deep conversations and tell each other their stories and be relationally courageous.
Yes. Yes.
Together. And they are still doing that. And I think that knowing you because their stories, they needed you in their stories. And for so many good reasons. And the challenges that you presented, just to be real and courageous and vulnerable and all along the way, and for them to just see your beauty and your strength and your leadership.
Thank you. Oh, that's so kind. Thank you, Sharon.
Has marked them, and I just appreciate that so much. So everyone, this is a collection of short essays. You can read a chapter within 10 minutes or so. And sometimes you need to put it down for a little bit because it's going to mess with your own story. And Ashlee, the story about what happened to you at Chipotle. Someone after being in a petting zoo and showing up with a lot of mud on you and everything else, someone assuming that you were probably homeless and in need and offering to pay for your lunch, which was a kind gesture, but really had such a different effect on you.
It was and that's what's tricky about this, because I truly do believe she was extending herself to me in kindness, and yet there were parts of that conversations that were just yellow flags where I realized, there are assumptions that she's making about me that perhaps served as the catalyst for her extending herself in this way. And it's those assumptions that really left a lasting impression. And that taught me a lot. That taught me a lot about, okay, when we talk about serving ministry or even extending help and compassion, how do we reevaluate the terrain of our own hearts and our motivations for why? So it didn't feel great to be on the receiving end of that interaction, and yet it taught me so much about how and why I enter into opportunities for compassion and helping and giving that I'm still thinking about, to be quite honest with you, in trying to build a bridge. Again, just lots of assumptions made. And yet, I left feeling like I needed to prove myself somehow. I wanted to refuse her help to prove that I could pay for my own lunch. And that didn't produce something great in me. But again, it taught me a lot. So I don't tie a lot of bows on these stories.
You don't. And because you leave them raw, that's why they challenge us to think through our own assumptions and our own decisions and actions and also, but just hopefully let kindness overcome.
Yes, that's right. Exactly.
And,
that's it.
And so I think that's part of what I appreciated, Ashlee, was that you didn't tie it up into a neat bow, because it's not going to get tied up into a neat bow. This is something we are going to be trying to figure out together, and hopefully together, and fumbling through together to figure out, because this is a combination of you sorting out your story and me sorting out my story in the midst of me reading yours.
Yes, that's right.
And there's a beauty in that, because the Holy Spirit gets mixed up in there and does some really good stuff.
Yes.
So
yes, and amen. The one thing I regret is that as people are processing their own stories through the lens of the book, I can't always be front row to how people are processing, and so for people that I know personally in the context of relationship, it's been really fun to see where those intersections are happening, or what's really resonating, or perhaps what's getting triggered in people. And so my prayer has consistently been, God, I trust that as people read, and as this bumps into their own story or opens up something else, that you would be the ultimate healer, that you would be the best listener, that you would be the one to whom we can bring all of our stuff and all of our questions and all of our wonderings and all of our awe, because the storytelling happens best in community, and it's just not possible to do that with a book like this. So I'm trusting the Holy Spirit to speak. I am.
Yes, and he is, and it's a courageous act to write a book like this and then just kind of send it out into the world.
I had a panic moment on release day back in April. I said, "Oh no, that. It's not just my mother reading this. This is," and she and I've had a lot of people ask, like, how does your family feel about some of these stories being told and people who are included here? And that was a really beautiful part of the process as well, inviting others into the writing of this and the perspective from which some of these stories were told. Because even though this was my perspective, it involved other people. And so a chief goal of mine too is to be honoring to how I told those stories, and giving people a heads up and inviting people to read the chapters before they were kind of in cement. And so I feel good about how those were represented. And I also had, again, a panic moment of going, oh my gosh, I feel like people are going to know me without knowing me. And how do I really feel about that? And whoops, it's too late.
Yeah, that ship has sailed.
It has sailed. So if you want to talk about surrender as a spiritual discipline, write a memoir and then just let it go.
It's a courageous act, but it's almost as if I want everybody who does listen to my life or has done listen to my life to read this book, because I think it will bring back particular kinds of memories and instances, and you have modeled for us some wonderful ways of going about doing this kind of work.
Yeah.
And this is a story, your stories are stories that will bump up against a lot of people, regardless of who you are.
That's right.
And invite us to take a look at particular kinds of themes that God might still want us to sort out, and what to take with and what to leave behind, and how we want to live and who we want to be as humans. So this human kind, and kind is in parentheses.
Yes.
So it's Humankind is the name of the book by Ashlee Eiland. And Eiland is E-I-L-A-N-D. You can get it on Amazon, would be probably my guess as to how most people are doing it right now.
That's how most people are doing it. It's available anywhere books are sold. So Target, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, wherever you like to buy your books.
Yeah. And I hope it just is one that just grows over time, because I think this one has a serious amount of lasting power. So Ashlee, thank you.
Sharon, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. This conversation was life-giving, and I so believe in the work that you're doing as well to invite people to the depths of their stories. So thank you. This was a joy.
I am thrilled that our stories have been intertwined in various ways, Ashlee. Many blessings to you and your amazingly beautiful family.
This podcast is sponsored by OneLifeMaps.com. creators of unique visual life mapping materials titled Listen to My Life, Maps for Recognizing and Responding to God in My Story. Go to onelifemaps.com to purchase your Listen to My Life portfolio of visual life maps. While you're there, check out our upcoming virtual coaching groups, live workshops, and options for you to facilitate the Listen to My Life experience with others. That's onelifemaps.com. onelifemaps.com. Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast with others. You can help support this podcast and the work of One Life Maps by supporting us on Patreon. Go to www.patreon.com/onelifemaps to pledge $5 or more per month and get weekly audio meditations to help you recognize and respond to God in your story. Thank you for tuning in to the One Life Maps podcast. Until next time, make the most of this one life that you've been gifted.